So Holy Trinity is about to start a bunch of new things, and I messed up last night and said this spring. It's not spring, it's fall, by the way. But it feels like spring to me because there's so much new going on. It's the beginning of school and all of those things, and one of the things that we're going to be starting in a couple weeks after Labor Day is it's called the Narrative Lectionary. And that doesn't sound super exciting, but it is. It's this really wonderful thing. What we usually do in the church is called the Revised Common Lectionary, and those are the readings we have on Sunday. We get those from a schedule that a lot of churches get, Lutherans, and if you have Catholic friends, Episcopalians, some flavors of Presbyterians, Methodists even, we all read the same lessons, and we have, it seems like forever, but it's really only been about since the 60s that all of us have been following this Revised Common Lectionary. Well, now there's a new lectionary that's coming out of Luther Seminary, and we know that it's super holy because it's from Minnesota. We know that it's been sanctified, way up north in the high holy place, but it's coming from Luther Seminary, and it's a lectionary that's meant to teach Lutherans, all of us, a little more about the Bible. And what it does, instead of having those 3 readings, which I don't know about y'all, but sometimes I forget the first one by the time we're at the end of the last one, instead of 3 readings, we're going to have 1. And we're going to focus on that reading for the whole service. And it's going to start where things usually start, which is Genesis. So we'll begin with Genesis 1 in September, and we'll go through the Bible, through a part of Genesis, some stories that you may have never heard before. Some people said to me, isn't the Revised Common Lectionary, the one we used to, doesn't that go through the whole Bible? No, no, it does not. There are stories that the Revised Common Lectionary leaves out that we haven't heard in church, that we haven't been able to preach about and to think about. And so some of those stories we're going to be able to talk about and really get into them. There's some amazing things in the Bible, and so it's going to go Genesis and then into Exodus and then into a little bit of the prophets, and then by Advent in December, we're going to read from one gospel and go all the way through. We're not going to jump around from John back to Luke, back to here and there, and so it's a little confusing. We're going to go all the way through one gospel throughout the school year. And so there'll be some continuity. I'm thinking, you might want to come the next weekend to see what happens next in the story, because it'll be continuous. You'll hear we're calling it the big picture, because when you kind of step back, it goes from Genesis on to Luke and then into Ephesians, into the very early church. So I'm really excited about this for a lot of reasons, but mostly because there are some things, like I said, that the Revised Common Lectionary leaves out. This story this morning from 2 Samuel, I don't know if y'all noticed this, but there's a gap in between verse 6 and verse 12 that we didn't read. The Revised Common Lectionary sort of surgically removes that part, takes it out. And when they do that, I always wonder, what did they not want us to read? What did they not want y'all to hear? You are smart people. You know there's a lot of things in the Bible. But this is really, it made sense to me once I read these verses that they cut out of there. But y'all need to know what they are. This is a great story. It starts out with King David. King David, and God has told him to bring the ark into Jerusalem. After a long time of the ark being moved around, God has spoken to King David and said, I want you to bring the ark into Jerusalem, and this is how I want you to do it. And God was really, really specific in the Old Testament. So God had all these guidelines for how to bring the ark into Jerusalem. And the ark was the presence of God. The ark, remember like in Raiders of the Lost Ark, that ark? Maybe not that ark, but an ark, the ark, it was supposed to have held God in this ark. And so there's specific ways that they had to treat it. And so they're bringing it into Jerusalem, and they're following the rules. And God said dance, and so they're dancing. And then all of a sudden, the ark, it says, and this is in the verses that are taken out, it says one of the oxen that was pulling the ark stumbled. And one of the priests that was walking in front of it reached out, like any of us would, to catch the ark. And he touched the ark, and he fell over dead. I am not making this up. It is in the Bible. God said, don't touch the ark, because in it is the very presence of God. Don't touch it. And so he reached out and he touched it to steady it because it was about to fall. But God said, don't touch the ark. And so he was struck over dead. So this is the part that they wanted to surgically remove, that they didn't want us to talk about. I can see why. What happened with David is that David was very discouraged, and David said, I'm going to pull the ark over. I'm going to stop. And David pulled the ark over into this house. His name was Obed-Edom. It was on the side of the road, so he pulled the ark over and he parked the ark and said, I'm not doing this anymore. It's too dangerous, this presence of God. But then what happened to that house is that Obed-Edom's house got really, really blessed. I mean, visibly blessed. He got crops. He got, a Christmas bonus. He got all kinds of things. His household was really, really blessed, and David reconsidered and said, God said to bring the ark into Jerusalem, and I want the people of God to be blessed like that, so let's take it up again. But 3 months had passed. That's in those verses that were taken out. 3 whole months had passed. So they go back and they get the ark, and they hold them very carefully, I'm thinking, very carefully, and they bring the ark, and God said dance, bring the ark with dancing, with celebration. So did you hear? David is dancing with all his might. I mean, wouldn't you? David is dancing and celebrating, and they have all of these tambourines and castanets and cymbals and handbells and a saxophone and a drum kit and all kinds of stuff. And they're going into Jerusalem, and they're celebrating before the Lord, and they stop every 6 paces, and they make a sacrifice to God, because that's how God said that the presence of the Lord should come into the city with all kinds of celebrations. God said celebrate, and so they did. And if you took those verses out, that's all you would hear, wouldn't you? Is that procession going into Jerusalem. Everything was great, and the handbells and the cymbals and all those things. They're going into Jerusalem, and it's really wonderful, and everything's great, and then they have a celebration, and everybody gets fed. But those verses, I think, are really important. Those verses taught David and taught everybody around that when God says the presence of God is too much for you, don't try to figure it out or even to touch it. Just let it be. Just celebrate it. They didn't respect that. They forgot. They followed a lot of those rules. They followed a lot of them. They were dancing, and they had it by the poles and all those kinds of things. But they forgot sometimes the power of God is not something that we can figure out or even touch. They forgot that the power of God is something to be feared and to be respected. We talk a lot about how God is our friend, and God is accessible, and God comes to us when we need God, and I believe that. But sometimes we forget that God is so powerful, that God creates life and God creates death. That God, who brings life out of death, there is power there, life and death power. And when we celebrate that, that's what we celebrate. We don't need to figure it all out. Sometimes, like David, we just celebrate before the Lord. We don't need to get all up in our heads about it. We celebrate. We follow God's rules. We respect that power of God that's over life and over death. Some of our artists remember that power, though. And by artists, I mean movies, because that's the kind of art that most of us see these days. I'm a kid of the 80s, and so I remember when I was a little too young, I saw Raiders of the Lost Ark. Maybe you did too. Little too young to see it, so I was looking through my eyes, and do you remember the last scene when the ark is in the middle of the desert, and the bad guys want to harness its power? They don't want it because they respect God. They want it because in that ark is ultimate power. And so they get the ark and they find it, and they know that there's ultimate power in the ark. And do you remember what happens when they open it? The power of God kills everyone who is there. It's very biblical. We forget this, but pop culture helps us remember that God, I remember watching, and no one could withstand it once they opened it up. Because God said, let the mystery be. Respect this power that I have. Don't try to go too close or harness it for your own use, or there could be life and death involved. The only ones who didn't die, you might remember, were good old Indiana Jones and Marion, because he said, somehow he knew, shut your eyes. Shut your eyes. Don't look right at it, because he knew that this power of God was too much. You can't touch it. You can't even look at it. But we respect it. We fear it even. We know that it's there. And so in David's story, when God said to David, you dance, and David danced, that was out of fear and out of respect. And yes, I believe at the end of his dance, it was out of joy before the Lord, that God is bringing God's presence into the middle of the people of Israel. There's this other story from 1 Samuel. And this reminded me a little bit of, Lutherans. There's another story where they're bringing the ark into the midst of a town. And so they bring the ark right into this town like this, and they're bringing the ark into the town. And God said, when the presence of God, when I am in your midst, what do? You dance. You celebrate, right? So the ark was brought into the middle of this town. And the people stood there like I imagine my people, the German Lutherans, standing there, had their arms crossed. They didn't do anything. The presence of God is in their midst, and they stood there just looking at it. And that town died. Yet again, not making this up, God commanded them to celebrate at the presence of God in their midst. And that is about life and death. It is serious. We can try to cut it out and make it pretty and make it cute, but we can't. Because God is a God of life and of death. And even when that death happens, I believe that God is a God of resurrection and can bring life out of that. But we fear and we respect the power of God. We let that mystery be sometimes. We don't have to figure it all out. We know that the power of God is in our midst. And so sometimes, like David, we celebrate and we dance, even if it's only on the inside. We celebrate and we dance in that presence of the Lord because God told us to. And because we celebrate that mystery that God is a God of life and of death. Amen.